All right, well, we're going to get started. Thank you so much for joining our live webinar here at noon called Free to Worship. My name is Kurt Weaver, and I'm the director of the Church Ambassador Network here at Pennsylvania Family Institute. And we have an important webinar here, some important topics that we're going to be discussing. So we're grateful that you have joined. Before we get started, I just wanted to quickly read some scripture here and then pray, and then we'll get into things. This morning I was reading in Isaiah 26 to be exact, and I thought these verses were very fitting for us during this time. It says this: "You keep him," this is God keeps him in perfect peace, whose mind is stayed on you, because he trusts in you. Trust in the Lord forever, for the Lord God is an everlasting rock." There's a lot of things being shaken in our world right now, but we know that we can trust the Lord forever, for God is the everlasting rock. And we know that we can find peace not in ourselves or in our circumstances, but we find peace in God when we keep our mind on him and trust him in all things. And so that's a good verse for us to ponder as we discuss the topics of today, as we see all the things that are happening in our world. And we know that we can have hope, and we can have faith, and we can have joy even in this world, because our hearts are set on him and trusting in God. Well, let me pray, and then we'll roll into a few items. Father, thank you so much for this particular day. Lord, continue to keep our hearts and minds fixed on you, and give us the peace that can only come from you. Lord, thank you that you are our everlasting rock, even in times of turmoil, even during a pandemic, even in the unrest that we see around our world, and even in a very difficult election season. Lord, I pray that you will bring peace to our hearts, for we know that you are sovereign and Lord and King over all, and we can trust you. In Jesus' name, amen. Well, before we dive into the issues of today, for those that are pastors or church leaders or just church members, we want to bring to your attention that we have put together some wonderful resources during this election season. And this election season, the stuff that we are putting together is called Honoring God 2020. Will you honor God with your vote on November 3rd? And we have voting information at pafamilyvoter.com. But we also put together a church toolkit that you can get for your pastor or church leaders. We have all kinds of wonderful materials, and I'm going to go through now that you can see that we have available. You can get that material by going to pafamily.org/honoring God. So you might want to write that down, pafamily.org, honoring God, to get your church toolkit. And here's what's in the toolkit. We have a wonderful video that churches can show in their churches or even send out. And I think you'll find this very beneficial.
As Christians, we know that honoring God means looking higher, that our lives are lived in light of a bigger purpose. And so we honor God with what we've been given: our families, our finances, our very lives. We honor him when we preserve the nation he's entrusted to us and steward our responsibility for our future. We honor God by looking higher than mere politics, acknowledging that God gave us government for our good, and treating our vote as a gift to use for his glory. As Christians, we are called to choose even when the choices are hard. So we must choose carefully, prayerfully. On this election day, will you look higher and honor God with your vote?
So that video is available to churches to utilize either in an in-person setting, or you can certainly use it in social media. We also have slides for registration. As you know, voter registration deadline is October the 19th. Please encourage those in your church and in your circles to make sure that they are registered. And then also we have slides that churches can use, like this one right here, that you can download and use either in a live setting or certainly use in social media. And then we have some materials for churches that we put together, kind of election-related guidelines for pastors and churches, what you can and cannot do within the church setting, and still be IRS compliant. We also have some other materials too that are very helpful. We have biblical principles for political engagement, 5 things to know, a legal guide for churches, courage and civility church toolkit from the ERLC, which are all very great materials that you can utilize. And then of course we have our 2020 voter guides available, which we've been doing for a very long time. And many churches have taken advantage of passing these out. But this year we also have available in a PDF form that you can send to your church if you're not doing in-person meetings. So lots and lots of things available for you. Again, make sure you go to our website, pafamily.org/honoringgod. Well, our webinar today is called Free to Worship, and we have a lot of things to discuss about the church around Pennsylvania and what they've experienced. Some churches have felt the pressure from government, from local municipalities when they decided to open. And there's lots of questions. There's been many questions during the pandemic of what churches can or cannot do. And so we have a lot of things that have happened during the last few weeks here in Pennsylvania to protect religious liberty here in Pennsylvania. So I'm going to pass things off to Randy Wanger. And Randy, let's hop into our first topic.
Well, there are a lot of things that happened just during the last week, actually. One of them was a lawsuit that came down last Tuesday called County of Butler versus Wolf. And it was challenging 3 things: the congregate order, the gathering limits of 25 indoors, 25 people outdoors, as well as the stay-at-home orders and business closure orders from earlier this year. And if you're a pastor on this call, you may say, well, as a church, I'm already able to meet, and the Department of Health said that I'm exempted, so everything's fine. I think you'll be interested in this lawsuit for a couple of reasons. One, it affects people in your congregation in a significant way, but it also has some prophylactic effects for the future. If we find ourselves in a situation like this again in the future, it describes some important limits in terms of what government can do and what it can't do. So with us today is Representative Daryl Metcalfe, representative from out in Butler County, and one of the plaintiffs on this case. I believe that's there. You're there with us by phone.
I am.
Representative Metcalfe, can you tell us, why did you file this case?
Well, Randy, thank you for inviting me to join you today, and hello to everybody that's there. I'm just coming in on my iPhone here for the call with the limited time that I have today. But myself and 2 other state representatives, Congressman Mike Kelly from out west, 4 counties. My county was the first county to move forward with saying that they would become a plaintiff in this case. We have several business owners that became plaintiffs, so kind of a 3-pronged approach from the counties to the elected officials that were filing as plaintiffs, as citizens, not as elected officials, but as citizens, based on how the actions of Tom Wolf and his Secretary of Health violated our rights as citizens and impeded our ability to express our First Amendment rights and other rights as we were candidates for office. So we joined as plaintiffs, of course. It's been a long process, but we were blessed with a superior opinion last week. Excellent opinion was written by Judge Stickman. An excellent victory that God blessed us with, that, as you said, declared that Wolf and Levine's orders for citizens to stay at home, for businesses to close, and for gatherings of individual citizens to be limited in size, their sizes of those gatherings to be limited, indoors and outdoors, that was all unconstitutional. And I think many of us from the beginning have been saying that the Constitution is not shredded, is not voided during times of emergency. And I found this to be very encouraging in the closing of the opinion by Judge Stickman. It's just a brief couple of sentences, if I can share it with you. He said, "But the solution to a national crisis can never be permitted to supersede the commitment to individual liberty that stands as the foundation of the American experiment. The Constitution cannot accept the concept of a, quote, new normal, where the basic liberties of the people can be subordinated to open-ended emergency mitigation measures. Rather, the Constitution sets certain lines that may not be crossed even in an emergency. Actions taken by defendants, that being Wolf and Levine, cross those lines. It is the duty of the court to declare those actions unconstitutional." Now, Wolf and his administration have filed a motion with the court for a stay to this decision, and those of us that are plaintiffs through our attorneys are the plaintiffs.
What does a stay mean for those on the call who are not attorneys? What is the Wolf administration filing for?
Well, my understanding, I'm not an attorney as you are, Randy, but you could probably give a better explanation than I. But my understanding is the stay would essentially put the decision that Judge Stickman made as far as its effect on the Wolf administration, would put it on hold until they could move forward with appealing the judge's decision. So we actually filed our answers back as plaintiffs through our attorneys to those stay requests, and we have many committed plaintiffs involved in this case that are going to continue the fight, and Lord willing, we'll be victorious on the other end. I know it's been a great encouragement to people around the country. My daughter lives in Florida, and there was a former congressional candidate that just was going to battle politically in the courts down here that referenced the case that we just had victory in, and I've been talking to another gentleman who's working on cases around the country that's been very encouraged by our cases. All of our citizens should be, and I've been advocating for many months now that ultimately the way that we regain our freedom is for our citizens to rise up and reclaim it themselves. I'm hoping that they follow our lead as plaintiffs in this case and challenging this as being unconstitutional, and that our church leaders, that our citizens, that they step forward, they start going back to their normal lives as far as working and having their weddings and being with those that are mourning when they have a loss. It's just really horrific what's been done to so many people across our state and nation with these unconstitutional decisions that have impacted them from the time that they're sick and able to have somebody sit by their bedside to their loss of a loved one, to their ability to put bread on the table. It's outrageous what's happened. We shouldn't stand for it as Americans, and that's why I became a plaintiff in this case.
Thank you, Representative Metcalfe. There are people on this call who are very concerned about COVID. There's some people on the call who are less concerned about COVID, and sometimes we lose sight of the constitutional principles if we're saying, look, I'm really concerned about how this is going to affect me. I'm really concerned about how this is going to affect the people I love. Why should those of us who are more concerned about the COVID be happy about a decision like that? And Jeremy or or Representative Metcalfe, how would you answer that question?
Well, I would, as far as when you look through, and I as a plaintiff, I was put on the witness stand by the Attorney General's office during this trial before Judge Stickman. As many of the other plaintiffs were called to the witness stand, and then we had our attorneys call Wolf's people to the witness stand. They were, I believe, the Attorney General's office called us just out of retribution for our attorneys demanding that Wolf's people actually be put on the witness stand. But out of the 66-page opinion, the judge had quoted some of what was said by various witnesses. And I think it should be alarming to anybody that is concerned about the virus and trying to find the balance of how do we deal with the virus and make sure that we're safe and make sure that we're healthy and remain so in our family members, especially those family members that are more susceptible to the consequences of this virus. I think it should be very alarming to all of us that the governor's witnesses, the governor's team that was working on this, those that came before the judge and gave testimony and were interrogated by our attorneys. Here's a little bit of what the judge has said about their testimony. Within the governor's office, a quote group, and this is to quote the governor's witnesses on his team, quote, was formed to work on issues related to the pandemic, unquote, both on the quote economic development side and pertaining to the business closures, unquote. And quote, on the health side, teams were formed to work to understand the progress of the pandemic, unquote. And then when you look at who made up that team, it says part of the group consisted of a reopening team and a policy team. The group, and this is out of the opinion, the group never reduced its purpose to writing, although, quote, its stated purpose was to develop mechanisms to respond to the emerging threat, i.e. a pandemic, in a very quick period of time, unquote. So they never put down what they were actually doing in writing. And when you look at who was part of that group, its members consisted solely of employees from the governor's policy and planning office, none of whom possess a medical background or are experts in infection control. The governor never attended meetings of the various teams, but he, quote, participated in regular calls and updates with members of his administration, unquote. And he, quote, was briefed and consulted on key matters, unquote. So we had decisions being made by a team who we don't fully understand who comprised that team and who the members were of fully, because their names weren't given to us even during this whole process. We just know these three individuals that they were part of the process. They didn't have any medical expertise. It appears they certainly didn't have any economic expertise based on the decisions they made and how it crushed our economy. But when you look at decisions that are being made, and if people are really relying on the response of the governor's office to keep them safe, then they're relying on a team of people that had no expertise to make any of the decisions or recommendations they were making, and ultimately did so in a very flippant manner that totally created chaos across our state and our economy and the lives of people. I think they should be held criminally liable and held responsible for what they did. As I read through the opinion, that was the thought that I was most struck with was, I can't believe that these people made these decisions that had such an impact on our citizens. And we had so many losses of life in the nursing homes because of the Wolf administration policy that was like the Como policy from New York. And they should be held accountable for it.
Representative Metcalfe, I appreciate your response. And for the people out there who are thinking, well, what if I agree with what the governor did? What if I like the response? What then? To that group of people, I would say this. The issues that were involved in this lawsuit, and particularly the problem that resulted in the lawsuit being filed and what Judge Stickman ruled, didn't have to do with necessarily, are these good responses or are these bad responses? A lot of it had to do with the process. And so the Constitution, in Judge Stickman's order, he referenced a statement that I think the Supreme Court made in the 1930s, that the Constitution itself was adopted in a period of grave emergency. This was something that they gave powers and they gave limits to the federal and states. And it wasn't something that they said should be altered by an emergency situation, but something that they actually created in the face of an emergency type of situation. And so the question is, what entity is responsible for making these laws, and how ought we do that? A lot of times, as Christians even, we look at rules and we look at verses like Romans 13 and say, ought we listen to the authorities? And the answer to that generically is, well, of course we should. But then the next question is, who is an authority and what legitimate authority do they have over the people? And in America, we have a wonderful system of laws. We're not a nation of men, we're a nation of laws, which is the way the Constitution was set up in response to a one-person rule that we saw in much of Europe at the time. And so in this context, when we have one person making these kind of rules, we can see, like Representative Metcalfe just outlined, how those things can go awry and can cause significant harm. And so the proper bodies to do these things, to make these rules and regulations, ought to be ones that are consulted and given the opportunity to make such rules. And the legislature, thankfully, in this instance, looked at that and said, as an independent judiciary, we have the ability to make that determination on whose authority it is to make these kind of rules and where that's overstepped. And that doesn't change just because there's an emergency situation. And so whether we're somebody who is very fearful of COVID-19 and believes that everything that Governor Wolf did was a great idea, that same individual can still look at what was done and say, but you know what? It wasn't your right to do that. You overstepped your authority. And thankfully, that's what the Judge Stickman ruled.
And that's part of the prophylactic effect of this ruling, which is to say, if we're in a similar situation in the future, there's an appropriate process to go through, and a weighing of the dangers as well. One of the things that the court pointed out was talking about these massive health concerns, but then giving exceptions for all kinds of large events, like one event with 20,000 participants, but at the same time we're limited to 25 people indoors and 250 people outdoors. And so whatever the government is claiming as its interest, it doesn't seem to be pursuing that interest well in light of the exceptions, or the fact that with the business closures, based on whether a business is life-sustaining or not life-sustaining, they didn't define what life-sustaining was, but determined that abortion clinics were life-sustaining businesses while other medical care was not life-sustaining. And at that point, you throw up your arms and say, what in the world is going on here? So it's a fascinating decision, and it's one that's going to have a lot of effect on us, depending on whether a stay is granted or not, and what the Court of Appeals does. Because at this moment in time, it takes away the gathering limits, but it's still hard to plan any gathering because we don't know whether a stay will be granted in this case or not. So, Representative
Metcalfe, are you aware of any oral argument date that has been set yet for that stay hearing?
I'm not. I haven't been made aware of that, or haven't caught that yet as I've been reviewing. As you can imagine, I'm getting a lot of information from our attorneys in this case. I'm working with some other attorneys and potentially another filing. We're also, just from the Republican caucus, we're filing for a stay now with the court's decision last week that they made on the election law that was unconstitutional, illegal from the Democrat activist Supreme Court in Pennsylvania. But related to what Randy had said regarding what people can plan for, the Carlisle Car Show people led, and I think are a good model, a good example for what all Pennsylvanians should do. And if we allow somebody in elected office to dictate to us when we when we would be allowed to exercise our freedom, and we actually submit to that, then we're becoming part of the problem. The Carlisle Car Show moved forward with their plans, forced the Wolf administration to take them to court. The Wolf administration hired third-party legal counsel, cut a secret deal with them, tried to hide the deal. We ended up submitting it as evidence in our case, but they were allowing 20,000 people into the Carlisle Car Show, which was, I had people out west that were canceling weddings, as you did in the central part of the state and eastern part of the state. I mean, I was hearing from people, somebody was going, I think, to move their venue to Ohio, I believe, for their family's wedding, for their family member's wedding. So I think our citizens need to stand up and live their lives based on this decision. These are unconstitutional actions. If Wolf is successful in getting a stay, the Constitution isn't given a stay. I'm not going to submit to any stay given for somebody to violate the Constitution, the very document that puts that man in office and puts me in office in the first place, that they turn around and violate. So if they violate the Constitution that put them in office, then they're totally illegitimate in what they're exercising. And it's a duty of our citizens to stand up and live as free men and free women and not submit to these type of unconstitutional dictates. That would be my encouragement to the people.
Well, Representative Metcalfe, thank you. Thank you for joining us today and giving some insight on what was going on in that lawsuit. And again, speaking to the audience here and speaking particularly to the pastors on this call, one of the things that we're trying to do in our law center here with the Pennsylvania Family Institute is do everything we can to make sure that churches are able to meet. And we've seen that come jeopardized in many other states. And while the Wolf administration later on in the game made it very clear that the churches were able to meet, that wasn't clear early in things right after the shutdowns. And so in response to that, Representative Clint Owlett and Representative Eric Nelson proposed legislation to try to fix that problem. And Representative Owlett, thank you for joining us today. And maybe you can tell the people on the call right now a little bit about the legislation that you introduced.
Yeah, and thank you so much for having me. And yeah, I can just go over this real quick, kind of what the issue was that we saw and how we tried to go about fixing it. And the day that we ran this on third consideration was the day after the court hearing that Representative Metcalfe was talking about. So it was really a great timing for us and for this bill to be able to reference some of the decisions that Judge Stickman made as well. So, but in reference to this bill, it was House Bill.
We
seems like we missed. Is he still on?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
You're back. Yep. Good. Welcome back.
Yes. So I'm from North Central PA, and our internet's like iffy. So, so I don't know if can you hear me now?
Yeah, it's good now.
So basically, what we saw was as representatives, we heard from a lot of constituents early on in this with questions. Is it okay for us to meet? And there were a lot of things that were in the FAQs from the administration that really made it very unclear as to whether it was okayed by the governor to meet. And then when we pushed them on that, they really didn't want to change much in the FAQs. They kind of wanted to leave it that, churches really should not be meeting and things like that. But that was when we were in the red and green and yellow phase opening process. But we knew that the Constitution was inherently clear, and we knew in our heart of hearts what Judge Stickman wrote, that the Constitution sets certain lines that may not be crossed even in an emergency. So we had a number of churches that were faced with really unprecedented situations where they were meeting and getting challenges by local municipalities. Representative Eric Nelson, he tells a story about a church in his district that even there were death threats being made. So it was a tough time for all of us. So we took this challenge on, and we tried to work with the administration and saying, listen, you're going to have to make it inherently clear in your FAQ that, because when you talk to them, they would say, no, we're not restricting anything. No, everybody, but then what was written was something different. And so we said, well, you need to change what's written and make it clear that the churches are allowed to meet. And they really didn't want to do that. So I said, well, then I'm going to write a bill. And so we wrote the bill, we got it introduced, and then they called and they said, we'll go ahead and I have the emails from them that said, go ahead, we'll go ahead and we'll change it to say encourage, not require, and encourage. So that was a good win. But thinking through this bill and where we were at and this pandemic, we felt that, you know what, we need to make sure that we fix this, we finish the job and we fix this. And in Pennsylvania, we have the Religious Freedom Protection Act of 2002. And that's where we put this piece of legislation. So not only do we have the Constitution, obviously, but then also in the state of Pennsylvania, we have this act that's existing that we would be adding this to, that basically says, you know, even in a emergency declaration, churches have the right to meet. And a lot of churches chose to do online platforms, which is really awesome to keep their parishioners at home and in a safe way to still stay connected. But I spoke on the House floor and said, like, we were made for community. We're made to be in relationship with each other. It's really hard to do over FaceTime or Zoom or whatever it is. And our churches wanted to be able to interact with each other. And that's so important. Our churches are really the hospitals for our spiritual and mental health. And that is so important in the midst of finished the job and got it through the House last week, and it's off to the Senate. And it was a good thing to get done. No matter who's in charge, I think that was the main gist of it. It's not, you know, we saw the true colors of where the Wolf administration was going with this and where they would have went if we didn't push back, and we felt like we needed to. But we got to make sure that we have these safeguards and these guardrails in place for whatever administration it is that would look to really challenge our right to worship here in the Commonwealth. And that's what we were founded on. So religious freedom is so important.
Well, I spoke to a good friend of mine last week, the day that this bill was passing, a doctor who said, well, you know, what if we have another disease coming? What if Ebola comes to Pennsylvania and suddenly it's exceedingly dangerous to be able to meet? Have we now tied the hands of the government to be able to do what's necessary in order to keep people safe? Do you have a response to that, Clint?
Yeah, and that's a great question. It's inherently clear that the legislature, it's our job to take on these challenges and to have good representation, you know, across the state when we're making the decisions. There's nothing in this that says that we can't take on any of those challenges, like you mentioned, head on and fix them as a legislature. And that's our job. And that's what we need to be ready and willing to do. And I think that's one thing that we also saw is the legislature in the midst of this pandemic, we were ready, willing, and able. I mean, we can vote from our offices in our district. Like, we can take on these challenges so quickly, and we can make the changes that are needed to keep people safe if we get to that point. And I think also, I truly believe that our pastors and leaders and religious leaders want to keep their parishioners safe. You give them good data, they're going to make the right choices. So I think that that's also in play. But if you're right, if there was a big type of another breakout of some sort that's even more lethal, we easily can fix any situation if we start to see an abuse. If we don't see an abuse, then why are we fixing something or trying to stop something?
Well, and it's true. We have seen through this entire process that it's easy to push power one direction, but it's harder to get it back again. It's easy to give power to the executive. It's hard to take that back again.
Government is a beast. The more you feed it, the bigger it gets, and it will never give you back anything that you give it. It just doesn't. It's gone. It's incredibly hard. So this is a rollback of power, which I think is I think it's a good thing, and I think it governors and administrations can make the case for sure. But if the thing that Stickman said, which I thought was great, the Constitution sets certain lines that cannot be crossed. So I had 2 interviews today already on this bill. So what are the certain lines? And our Constitution should be leaned on even more in the midst of emergency and pandemics or whatever. We should be leaning on that to guide us and help us through it. It's worked us through so many issues before. Why do we feel like all of a sudden now we just can like throw it in the wind? Like we need to lean on it, and it's helped us. So I think that, religious freedom is one of those certain lines. If religious freedom is not, then what is? Like what is it that is a certain line? I feel like, and that's why we had such a good vote. It was 149 to 53. I think we had 40 Democrats that voted for it. Now there's still 53 that decided not to. But I think that it's got a veto-proof majority. The ruling the day before helped us out. But I think people are realizing and waking up and saying, yeah, this might be good to have, a check on government intrusion into our lives.
And to be clear, I do want to emphasize again that this was a bipartisan vote. It was just a across the board good government vote. For those on the call who may be thinking that that we're partisan in the way that we're looking at these issues, religious liberty should not be considered a partisan issue. And when whether Democrats or Republicans get it right or get it wrong, we should say so. And in this case, we're grateful that Governor Wolf got to the point of being able to clarify that churches ought to be open. And so we want to give him thanks for that, because in some states that wasn't so clear. And we've seen some of those cases go up to the Supreme Court, which again is why a bill like this is necessary, even though Governor Wolf has now said, yes, churches can meet and the numbers restrictions don't apply to them. It's what happens in the future. Do we want this power to be in the hands of another governor, whether Republican or Democrat, in the future? And what is that going to do to our ability to worship? Will it look like Nevada or California? Or will we have the freedom to be able to have pastors be able to make choices based on the data, how to balance following safety, keeping their people safe, but doing the job that the church is supposed to be doing?
Randy, when you reference Nevada, what he's talking about there, just for the audience, is where the state said that if you're a casino, you can be open based on a percentage of the people who can fit in to the building. But if a church owned the same size building, they would not be able to work on that same premise. We're prioritizing gambling over top of religious liberty in some of our states, and that's something that we can't do. I would add one more thing. One thing that stays the same and one thing that changes. The thing that stays the same is when you have absolute power in the hands of one person, they tend to want to keep that, because in everybody's mind, they're a benevolent person who wants the best for everybody. And so I think we've seen that. It's a great civics lesson for everyone to see when an emergency power is given, and then the legislature says, you know what, we're fully capable of taking care of this issue. We're going to take this power back now. And then they vote on it. And then the governor vetoes the ability for the legislature to have a say. That's kind of the whole reason why I think our government was set up the way it was, and what we've seen from time out of mind, that when you consolidate power in the hands of one person, it doesn't come back very easily. Now, the thing that changes, that was the one thing that stays the same. Here's the one thing that changes. In the past, we had emergency powers for a particular reason. It was very difficult and in a quick emergency where there's not a lot of time to act, where the people in the legislative bodies live across the state, and it took them a long time to get to Harrisburg to be able to get caught up on the information and then make a decision. We needed somebody who could act quickly to halt off a bigger emergency. And we sort of saw that in maybe the first week or two of this instance. But what's changed now is that, number one, we can get places a lot quicker. Number two, just like we're having this meeting now, the people in the legislature can get information so much quicker, and they're able to vote over platforms like Zoom. And why is it so important that we have the legislature make decisions and discuss with each other in the first place? Well, one of the reasons is because Representative Nelson, Representative Owlett, and the rest of them, they're in your local communities. They can sit down and have a conversation with you and have a conversation with the church bodies and the business owners and understand how these things are going to impact individual people. And they can talk to them and find out what kind of safety measures they can do, which ones would be too burdensome, so that they can craft legislation that's going to, as best as possible, address the needs of everyone. When we have that and it's working effectively, and it's never going to be perfect, but that's the best we can do with bad situations in states of emergency. And I think that we commend you, Representative Owlett and Representative Nelson, for working towards that laudable goal. And just to reiterate that this is not about saying if you're a religious group or a church, you should be able to do whatever you want to. Sometimes people make that kind of argument, and it's really a straw man argument, because that's not what's being addressed. It's who has the legitimate authority and who's best situated to be able to make decisions when it comes to this.
And I just want to reiterate that the Wolf administration, the Secretary of Health, were going down a path that was very similar to other states that had a really hard lockdown and restriction on churches. That was the direction we were headed. They did not, when we talked through this, they did not want to give up on the 25 person. I mean, and that was, I remember having multiple phone calls, with them about that. They didn't want to do that. And I remember saying, so you're telling me that if I have a church that's similar to a big box store in my district, that big box store can have 400 or 500 people in it, but I have a church that's very similar in size, and they can't have more than 25? Like, really? Like, is that really the direction we want to go? Well, that's what we're saying. So the piece of legislation, that's how we speak. I think you talked, that's really great, Jeremy, because like, how are the people of the 68th district, Tioga, Bradford, and Potter County, how is their voice heard in Harrisburg? It's heard through legislation. And that's how we can address issues as they come up. And that's how what we've been saying from the beginning of this pandemic is we want to engage in the process. We are here ready, willing, and able to work on this. We even passed legislation, and it would have been wise for the governor to do this, that would have established a task force made up of the House and Senate and even the judiciary, I believe, to work with the governor to craft a plan and a solution of how to address the issues. Well, then that would have brought representation from all across the state. We would have recognized that, hey, we don't have a medical, person here, and we could have avoided a lot of things that we've been going down, the roads we've been going down. It didn't have to be like this. And I think that, when we work together, we can achieve great things. When you have one branch of government, and that's what we're talking about here, is one branch of government that's stating one plan, and this is what we're doing for multiple months, it really sidelines the people of the state, and especially my district. And that's how we've felt like, hey, we got this, don't worry about it. Well, we haven't even talked on the phone. You don't even know what's going on. Like, you haven't been north of Route 80 in who knows how long. Like, let me be a part of it. Like, that's what I was elected to do. Let me be a part of it. We can hash this out and figure out a solution. And I think that's what this is all about. I mean, this is, if there's issues in the future, we can deal with it effectively. But just having one person take power and head down a really dangerous road. And I'm really glad that my colleagues, came alongside and helped me through this bill, especially Representative Nelson, and just pull back those reins a little bit and be able to, because it's true and right and just. And that's what's so important. So, and thank you for your help on this too. I mean, just, your encouragement through this and the support that we got. So I appreciate everybody's help, and we're looking forward to continuing to serve the folks here in the 68th district and across the Commonwealth, and make sure that religious freedom is alive and well in the Commonwealth. That's what we were founded on.
Well, thank you so much, Representative. And it's great to have you on this webinar. And thank you for fighting for religious liberty here in Pennsylvania. We're going to transition into some Q&A. So if you have a question, please put it in the Q&A. You see the button below, and you can put your question in there. I was just going to talk briefly about how things rolled out. And as many of the churches know, we've done many webinars on this issue. We've helped churches throughout the pandemic to know what they were able to do legally and to help them interpret some of the things that were coming from the Department of Health. I must say this, we are thankful to the Department of Health for allowing us to do a number of pastoral calls. We've had thousands of pastors on the line talking to the Secretary of Health, so we appreciate that. And then also, in the beginning of all this, in the pandemic, the administration said that churches were essential businesses and that they were exempt from the emergency orders, but didn't really clarify that. They did give some guidance to encourage churches to go online and to come up with alternatives to in-person meetings. And then even throughout the emergency orders, it was hard to tell if the churches were exempt from the stay-at-home order, like Representative Owlett said, until later, where they came out and they were very specific that churches were exempt from the gathering limitation. So it was a little hard for churches to navigate some of this stuff. So thank you for putting this bill out there, and we're grateful for the bipartisan support. It's obviously clear that others watching saw that this was important as well.
Hard to navigate is an understatement, because we were all involved with churches trying to figure it out, some of whom were told by local police that they weren't allowed to be open. So clarity was a very good thing.
Yeah, whoever came up with we should be a nation of laws and not a nation of men, I think would agree that it's even worse to be a nation of frequently asked questions. Rather, I mean, and that's sort of what we've become. We've been governed by frequently asked questions on websites, and that's no way to live. So the first question is, does the ruling have an effect? And I'm assuming this is about the district court opinion upon the social distancing requirements. Won't the social distancing requirements then affect gathering numbers? So the court case was about the aggregate numbers of people. So the 25 or the 10, it didn't deal, and Randy, correct me if I'm wrong, it didn't deal with the percentage numbers.
That's correct. So it struck down, at least for the time being, the 25 indoor, 250 outdoor that applied across the board, not to churches, but
correct,
but otherwise applied across the board. So that was struck down, but they didn't address the 25, 50, 75% occupancy that applied to certain businesses, but not others.
Right. And those don't even apply outside. So there really aren't
correct
outside limits at this point.
Right.
So
one of the other questions has to do with the mask mandate. I don't know if you attorneys, Jeremy or Randy, or even Representative Owlett would like to discuss, does the court case, Butler County versus Wolf, or even Owlett's bill, does that address the mask mandate?
The lawsuit does not address the mask mandate. So as far as that court case, it makes no difference. Clint, how would you answer it insofar as your bill is concerned?
Shocking. Somebody wants to talk about masks, right? No, that's a really great question. So all our bill does, and what I can just tell you is it has to do with the Disease Prevention Control Act. So I have to go back and look and see. One of you guys might be able to answer this. I don't know if the mask mandate was underneath that Disease Prevention Control Act. If it was, then it would make sense that that this would, I mean, I'm not sure, but it would have to look and see where that was at, or if it was an executive order, how that was all taking place.
My answer to the question that I asked you is yes, your bill would in the future affect that sort of thing, because there would need to be a specific application to churches. But your bill is not yet law. It's a bill.
Right.
And so that's not
still
to
a
say,
long ways away.
yeah. So it's the sort of thing, again, for like the friend who was asking me last week, well, what if Ebola strikes or something else? Yeah, as a government, we can put all kinds of restrictions in place, but let's do it collaboratively, as with all of the checks and balances that go along with a Republican form of government, where we've got the legislature working in concert with the governor, in consultation with health officials, and make a determination in those circumstances. So we still know how to pass laws in the Commonwealth, correct?
Correct. Well, we can do it pretty quick when we have to.
Yeah.
And I think it would also be, we've learned a lot about this pandemic and COVID. And I think it'd be worth mentioning. I'd have to look at the dates of when some of that, like the masking orders came down and stuff, but I don't remember. I have to look and see, but we may have been in the times when we were encouraged not to wear masks, when we were, I don't remember what the time frames were, but I would need to, you know what I mean? So I think things have changed a lot, but to answer the question, I don't believe, if it was under the disease prevention, that's what this is specifically saying. And that's where the governor himself is grabbing so much of this control, is through that act of 1955.
Good, excellent. So some people are wondering, Representative Owlett, where things stand currently with your bill. What are the next steps? And are churches free to do what they want to do because of this legislation?
So nothing changes from where we're at right now, as far as, like Jeremy said, living in the FAQ world. But as far as the path forward, it's off to the Senate now. I haven't looked to really see if it was which committee it was referred to, but it'll be referred to a committee, and hopefully we can get a committee vote over there, and it can work through the process and make it to the governor's desk. But the Senate has its own process and its own time frame that they work under, and there's very little that we can do, but constituents can. So if this is something that you say, you know what, this is a big deal, like this could be a big help, and it would be some guardrails for the government, you could call your senator and say, hey, House Bill 2530 would be a phenomenal piece of legislation to move in the Senate, and any advocacy that you could push as constituents would be helpful.
Good. Well, thank you for that. It's starting to get a little cooler outside, and churches that were meeting outside are now considering moving indoors. And that certainly brings up issues that some churches haven't had to deal with over the summer months. Some churches are meeting in person, and they're doing their best to still keep people social distanced, and also encouraging folks to wear masks. What would some recommendations you all have for churches that are trying to make that transition? Don't all speak at once.
I'll let one of you guys. I took the last one. I don't know if you guys want to take some.
I'm an attorney, so I can speak as an attorney as to what the law is. I am not a health official, so I'm not going to speak to what's wise in terms of keeping your congregation safe. There's a lot of ambiguity in terms of, there's not ambiguity overall in terms of a mask mandate being in place. There is some ambiguity in terms of how that applies to churches. And So I think this is an issue that the churches can follow their own conscience and wisdom on, but what that should be, that I don't want to speak to.
And I'm also an attorney, and I'm not going to speak as a health official, but I will speak from a government context, because again, I think I alluded to this earlier, but sometimes churches look at these type of issues and they say, well, Romans 13 says we should respect authority and follow what the government says. Sometimes that's the end of it. Other times we need to ask some further questions. And so what happened out in Western District of Pennsylvania with that lawsuit was the governor has said something, and we think it's illegitimate because it violates other laws, or it wasn't his responsibility. It violates the Constitution. And so we need to make sure that we're assessing that and taking steps to protect the law and protect the system that is supposed to be in place. And with the masks, there are legitimate concerns that what is being done oversteps authority, isn't proper, violates people's rights. There's also obviously health concerns that people can debate. Representative Owlett, you brought up earlier how in the beginning they were telling people not to wear masks because masks don't work. Now today they're telling people to wear masks, but yet they're also telling them not to use the most effective masks like N95 because they want to save those for other people. So there's some concerns about the rightness or wrongness of the legitimate authority for issuing a mask order. There's some concerns about the rightness or wrongness of whether they actually help and when they help. There's some concerns about even the application of it when it comes to what it prevents, which is the big droplets, versus the times that we're told that we can take it off. So you have to wear a mask when you're walking into a restaurant, but when you sit down right across from somebody and you're eating food, you're probably more likely to have big droplets while you're speaking and eating food at the same time conveyed to the person across the table than you would when you're just walking to your table. So there's a lot of things that don't make sense. And so we don't want to take those issues and completely don't acknowledge them. And so if you're a church, I would caution you, I would encourage you first to talk about those nuances. That's important. It's important for people to understand that those are legitimate concerns on both sides, and that we can't just solve them for people by saying, well, Romans 13, we should just follow whoever the government is. If somebody walked in your home and said, I'm bigger than you and stronger than you, now make me dinner, and you said, what do you mean? This is my house. And I pointed to Romans 13 and said, I'm now in control, make me dinner. I think most people could look at that and say, well, that's not a legitimate order. You're not a legitimate authority. And so having a deep conversation about when we have to obey things that maybe a government actor, but maybe it's not their right to do it, has. Those are conversations that our church should be having. Similar to if in the context of war, what is a just war? We shouldn't just cover the surface of these things, because people in our congregations are having a difficult time understanding where lines should be, and we should be helping them to address those things biblically, but not be afraid to do a little bit of a deep dive into it, because we're going to have a better prepared congregation of lay people who can engage the culture biblically, as opposed to just using a quick biblical reference without any further analysis. Right, so yeah. They're hard questions. Legally, they're hard questions. They're sticky, difficult issues to bring up with church members, because there's people on both sides of the issue as far as whether it's helpful, whether it's not helpful, whether it's a legitimate order, whether it's not. But do the work, and I think your congregation in the state of Pennsylvania will be better because of it.
Yeah, thank you, Jeremy. And I would just end with this. Those who are making decisions for your own particular local church, they're not easy decisions to make. If you're a congregant, you know that your pastors are making difficult decisions as well. So give them grace as they try to do what's best for your congregation. And churches, please reach out to us if you need advice or help. We're here to help. We've been doing this, helping churches throughout the pandemic since the beginning. And so we're here to help and do what we can to help churches to be able to be free to continue to advance the gospel, preach the gospel, to live out the gospel. Churches who are trying to make decisions, we are praying for you as you decide how to navigate this and what to do. But know this, you don't have to be afraid. We know that God is with you. God is with your congregation, and God is going to give you wisdom, the wisdom that you need to make the best decision for your church and for your community. And I would reiterate, we all know that we represent Jesus Christ, and we want to be a shining light to our community, and we want to represent Christ in such a way that brings glory and honor to him. Well, thank you, Representative Owlett, for being on this webinar, and thank you for all that you're doing to bring religious freedom into our state. Randall Wanger, Attorney Wanger, and Attorney Samick, thank you so much for joining us here this morning, and thank you to all who joined our webinar. I'll pray, and then we'll close our time. Lord, again, we pray that you will continue to give us wisdom during this time. Father, we can trust you, and we know that you will give us wisdom when we come and ask, and may we not doubt. Lord, I pray that you'll be with all the people on this webinar, continue to help them, and Lord, I do pray that you will advance the gospel in this world, and I do pray that you will bring this pandemic to an end and bring health back into our communities. Father, we thank you so much for good leadership. Thank you for those that are making a difference in the legislature. Thank you for Representative Owlett, and thank you for Representative Metcalfe, Lord, that you'll be with them and give them the boldness and the encouragement that they need even today. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, thank you all for being on here, and I hope you have a blessed day. Goodbye.